Welcome to today's webinar on helping students cope with stress. Next slide, please. This webinar is being sponsored by the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers, the School of Health Professions, and the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Ghazaly, and I'm the project coordinator of the center and will be facilitating the webinar today. Next slide, please. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illness. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link that appears on your screen. Please, next slide, please. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. These surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with a PowerPoint slide in the next couple of days. We also encourage you to interact with our presenters during their webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer those questions. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCants-Katz is serving as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have PJ Wenger with us today. PJ has 29 years of experience working in the field of mental health. She has spent considerable time in a variety of settings developing her counseling practice. These settings include psychiatric emergency, inpatient treatment with both adults and children, in-home counseling for mental health issues, residential treatment, schools, and private practice. In the school setting, PJ has worked at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And in addition to this experience, PJ has been a trauma responder at the state, local, and national level. She has responded to large events like 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, as well as traumatic events that affect schools, such as suicide, traumatic deaths of staff, students, and homicides. She is licensed by the New Jersey Board of Family and Health Professionals, Practitioners, and is a certified member of the National Board of Certified Counselors. She has a master's in counseling and an EDS in marriage and family therapy. Now I'll turn it over to PJ, and welcome.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here today. So here's our objectives. So today we're going to talk about stress and how it looks in children. We're going to talk about how COVID has affected children's stress levels. We're going to do some identification about how stress and mental health really parallel each other in terms of the signs and symptoms that we're going to see. We're going to identify how we can help children deal with stress, what we can do as teachers, and hopefully I'll be providing you with some concrete strategies and resources. If you have particular questions about a situation, please save it for the Q&A and I'll be happy to address it. So I start with defining stress. And when we define stress, we're really looking at something, an event, or some situation that causes us to be overloaded. So it's defined as a mental or emotional strain that is very demanding on us. So stress can be episodic or it can be chronic. So episodic is something that maybe there's a test. And so during this period where there is the test, a child becomes overwhelmed, they're very stressed out because they feel like they can't meet those demands that are expected on the test. And so we call that an episodic stress. Whereas chronic stress is something that is prolonged over time. And I believe that initially with COVID, we thought it was going to be more short term than it is. And it certainly contributed a great deal to stress, both of adults and children. But it certainly has become a prolonged event that we are dealing with. So just to identify those two types of stress, and we'll come back to them. I use this visual because I think we need to understand that stress affects everything in our lives. And sometimes we don't realize how many things it affects. So when we look at this picture, it looks really busy, but if we look at some of the key things that it's talking about, stress affects our interactions with people. It affects how we respond. It affects how we eat and take care of ourselves. It affects our mindset, whether we become negative or pessimistic, or whether we become hopeful and optimistic. It affects our body. People feel stress in their body. If I asked you, where do you feel your stress? You would probably be able to respond to me: in my neck, in my shoulders, in my back. These are things that stress affects in our body. It affects how we respond and our actions. Oftentimes, I've been on a couple of responses during this COVID time where children are telling me that their parents are very irritable and losing their patience with them a lot. That certainly is how stress affects our actions. So I really love this picture because I think it really depicts how stress affects so many facets of our life that sometimes we're not even aware of. So what we're seeing secondary to COVID, I think it's important for us to identify some of these things. The crisis text lines have seen a 20% rise in the calls to the text line and the text to the crisis line since before COVID. The top 3 hot topics are anxiety, depression, and substance use. So again, we're seeing more conversations about domestic violence. We know that the domestic violence calls have increased by 35%. We also know that domestic violence shelters are full. And again, when I'm telling you some of these statistics and things that we are aware of, understand that while most of this looks like it applies to adults, it all applies to children. Certainly, we have increased conversations about job loss, about grief around death. There's been some, racial issues that have been very prominent in the news that have affected children, especially our teenagers. There's been a shift of people over 35. So again, if we're thinking about our parents of children and school-age children, they are 35 or older, and they are talking about how they are having an increase in anxiety because of some of these things that COVID is affecting. There are more people on the front lines that are operating from a place of fear of what's next. So again, imagine being a child in a household of a frontline worker. Again, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of hopelessness. Certainly our marginalized populations are being tremendously affected. Our Latinx community are mentioning that they are seeing significantly higher rates of discrimination, racism, financial issues, loss of loved ones, and they are significantly more likely to have a parent that is an essential worker. So, a lot of our marginalized populations do work on the front lines in jobs that are closely affected by COVID. Asian Americans were experiencing a great deal of racism at the onset of COVID. Some of that has decreased. However, they still report feeling discriminated against and having some of those experiences. We know that our African American population are experiencing loss of loved ones 2 times higher the rate of other people. And again, think about our children, that is affecting them as well. So we really need to look at all of those things. Stress during an infectious disease outbreak can sometimes cause some of the following. Certainly fear and worry. We worry about us getting the COVID. We worry about our loved ones getting the COVID. We worry about losing our jobs, losing, our financial stability. And then what happens is there's changes in eating and sleeping patterns. I can't tell you how many adults and teenagers and young children are reporting that they are having trouble sleeping, that they're having nightmares. that they're either overeating or undereating. Again, these are things that this particular situation has caused. Difficulty sleeping. So again, difficulty concentrating. So think of our young children, adolescents and younger, middle school, and they're experiencing all of these things. It's very hard to concentrate. Some people are experiencing increased health problems due to an already existing condition. Certainly, we know that mental health conditions are being taxed in terms of people who have already had a pre-existing condition, having those conditions worsen based on the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen an increased use in tobacco, alcohol, and other substances. I think in March, I believe in June, they said that wine sales had increased by 100 and some percent. That's a big increase for use. So again, if I'm in a household where my parent is turning towards substances to manage their anxiety or stress, I'm in that household experiencing that as well. We see young children regressing, and we see teenagers experiencing more depression. Again, we thought when the pandemic started that teenagers would be okay because they're always on their phones and they're always texting, but we didn't really understand or appreciate the amount of face-to-face that teenagers needed. And so the social distancing is really causing a great deal of trouble for them. And then again, all children, younger teenagers, middle school students, all vamp off of the adults who are around them. So for instance, I had a client in therapy, and she suffers from anxiety already. And so COVID just exacerbated her anxiety in terms of, who is going to get it that I love, and am I going to get it, and how to protect my child. And so at one point she called me and she said, I cannot get my child to leave the house. Now her child was 5 years old. So we did an intervention with herself and mine. And here the child said, I can't go out of the house because the COVID monster is hiding behind the bushes. And so based on her mom's anxiety around COVID, the child, again, a child's mind, decided that COVID was actually this monster that was hiding behind the bushes. And that's why she wouldn't leave the house. And so again, children will vamp off of our responses and what we model. So we really had to do a whole intervention that COVID was not a monster. He was not hiding behind the bushes, to be able to get this child just to leave the house. So again, children will watch what we do and model so. So some of the stresses of COVID: fear and worry, definitely fears of a bunch of things. Fear of, financial loss, fear of disconnection, fear of getting COVID, fear of my loved ones. So lots of things that people are worrying about. I know, when some of the racial tensions were very high, I had teenagers who were saying, I'm afraid somebody's going to break into my house, and I'm afraid they're going to riot in the streets and light fires, and was really scared about all those things. So in addition to COVID, we have this parallel racial inequity issue that's going on that's also causing a lot of fear and worry. Financials: people are losing their jobs, people are losing their homes, people are being displaced. Certainly people who are in the hospital and loved ones can't visit them. Employment: I don't have to tell you about the unemployment rate. It's really hit hard. The entertainment business and also the service industry, waiters, waitresses, bussers, those kinds of people who had those jobs. Support systems. Our support systems we reached out to people, we went to see people. Now some of those support systems are not there. And initially, when COVID was coming about, we all turned to the remote platform. And I think what we're finding now is that people are suffering what we're calling Zoom burnout or Zoom fatigue, and they don't want to be online anymore, and they don't want to be sitting in front of a computer, and that doesn't feel like connection or support to them. Certainly parent-teacher roles have changed. Parents who are at home, who are now teachers, and teachers who are working sometimes round the clock and can't seem to get a good balance between my home and my teaching role. So again, changes in appetite, sleep, and some of our routines have definitely changed. And we're responding to that with a level of stress. So identifying signs of COVID stress. COVID stress is a little different than regular stress because sometimes when we are stressed out by the daily things, having to get to work on time, having to do my job, having to put, supper on the table, coordinate all the kids' schedules and activities, those are certainly stressful, but COVID has elevated the stress to another level. And sometimes we're not always aware of it because we're not listening to the things that teenagers and children are saying. And these are some of the things that the teenagers have been saying. And so we need to pay attention to this and really zone into it, because a lot of times if they're not saying it in a way that we can hear it, we may not be hearing it and we may be missing it. So teenagers will often say, not so much fear has mobilized me. I hear more that they say I'm stuck. So again, when they say I'm stuck, I am asking the question, what does that mean? What does stuck mean? Tell me what that means. Or I feel trapped. Okay, what does trapped mean? Tell me about that feeling. So I'm really allowing them to put a label on what they're feeling, but I'm also making sure that they are still engaged in life and living versus jumping that track to maybe I don't want to be here anymore and I might want to kill myself, and I have to be careful about those things. I can't do this anymore. I don't want to get out of bed. We're seeing that a lot with some of our teenagers who are not showing up online, and I know that teenagers have said to me, I don't see the point anymore. I don't see the point. This is a wasted year. It's not going to mean anything. And unfortunately, last year, in terms of colleges, a lot of colleges were eliminating test scores, and we're not looking at the second half of the year in terms of grades. They were giving that accommodation and allowances so that students would not be penalized by that big change and the adjustment. So now some of the students are now saying, like, what's the point? They're just going to waive all this anyway. I have students who tell me they turn on the remote, they put on their picture, and they go back to bed. So again, we really have to be looking at what that stress looks like. When teenagers or middle school age children say to me, I just can't. Okay, I just can't what? What can't I do? And I'm hearing a lot of can't. And can't is sort of a negative, I call it a negative rabbit hole. So when we're in the can't place, we go down that negative rabbit hole. And you'll hear me talk about a little later, one of the strategies is to get children to reframe and move into the what can I do? There's a lot of things I am not able to do right now, but there are also a lot of things that I can. I'm freaking out. That's a really good teenage one. And again, when a teenager says that to me, I ask them, what does freaking out look like? What does that look like to you? Because me freaking out and you freaking out are two different things. So I get them to describe it to me so I can really understand it from their perspective. Certainly I'm losing it. I've heard that from adults and from teenagers. I'm barely keeping it together. That's another very scary one. What does that mean? Barely keeping what together? So again, when children are saying these things, I need to put on my detective hat and really try to figure out what they're doing. The day goes by and I don't do anything but lay on the couch and watch TV. I've had students tell me that. I just lay in bed. In my practice, I have a teenager who basically doesn't leave her room. And when I Zoom with her for her appointments, the first couple minutes are, okay, you need to put on some kind of lights so that I can see you, so that you and I can have a conversation. And she willingly does it for me. But the fact that she spends the remainder of most of her time in her room with the lights off is concerning to me. So again, we have to be a little creative about how we are recognizing these signs and what we're doing with them. So I wanted to really just touch on the mental issues that we're seeing because of stress and the amount of stress that is a result of the pandemic. Certainly anxiety, that's probably the number one. And again, it could be existing, or it could be a child who's already suffered from anxiety and the condition is just exacerbated, or it can be something they're newly experiencing. Certainly the pandemic has caused a lot of anxiety, and some teenagers are just not familiar with what that anxiety is. So I had a teenager the other day, the parents called me on, she had a panic attack. good student, going along, has never had any kinds of issues, and all of a sudden is having a panic attack. And again, when we really got down to the meat of it, and I put on my detective hat and we talked about it, we found out that she was really afraid of going back to school in person. And her school was talking about going back into person right after the new year. And so she was already building up this anxiety about doing that, and worked herself up so much that she had a panic attack. And resulted in an ER visit, because of course we always check out medical issues first, and then realized that it was in fact a panic attack, and we had to address the underlying fears that created that. And again, a child who had never had any pre-existing conditions. We're certainly seeing depression a lot in our teenagers, some in our middle schoolers, but more so in our high school level teenagers, because of the social isolation that they are feeling. And also because of some of the discrepancies. Some of their friends, their parents are not as cautious in terms of social distancing and keeping themselves away from people that they don't know, whereas other parents are now, letting up on some of the precautionary measures and allowing their children to interact with each other. And so, of course, children are on Instagram or FaceTime or whatever social media they're on, and they see their friends gathering together, and they, because their parents might be very cautious, are being left out of that. And so again, that might be causing some depression. Substance use. I've heard a lot of the teenagers tell me that there's an increase of vaping and the use of marijuana. And unfortunately with marijuana, because they now are aware that in New Jersey, the bill was passed to legalize marijuana, although I keep telling them that will take months and months for that to actually happen, they really think it's okay now. So there's been an increase of that among our teenagers. And again, grief. And grief is not just about our children losing a loved one, which it could be, but it's also grief around the things that they have lost that they can't get back. So simple things that we don't even think about sometimes: the first day of school and wearing my new outfit to the first day of school, school dances, school graduations, proms, rites of passage, birthday parties and bar mitzvahs and things like that, that children have looked forward to for so long, and they've been erased by this pandemic and the fact that we can't do those things. Anticipatory grief, students and teenagers are grieving what they anticipate to be a loss. So they're already thinking about their graduation is not going to look like it has in the past, and they may not have a prom, and what happens with that, and how does my senior year look, or how does the school year look? My ninth graders are very upset because they were very excited to go to high school, and high school had all of these things that they were looking forward to, and none of those have happened because we're remote and we're struggling through the remote process. So mental health issues parallel very closely the stress of the pandemic. So I just wanted us to make that connection. So stress in young children, this is my little stress monster. I love them. Children have trouble concentrating. There might be behavioral changes. They might have outbursts. We might view them as being sarcastic or disrespectful. Certainly there are fears. They might develop nervous habits. So things like I've had children around the middle school teenager age have difficulty with checking doors and locking doors and things like that, which they had never done before. Certainly hand washing has become a ritual, a practice that we all do as often as we can, because that's what the CDC guidelines direct. And so some children are becoming very nervous and very ritualistic about hand washing over, above and beyond what is expected. And that can have some negative effects. Some children are withdrawing because they're not able to see friends, or withdrawing because they themselves are having fear about interacting with people and possibly getting the virus. School refusal. School refusal just used to be kids who would not actually go into the building of a school, but we're seeing school refusal in children who will not get online. And that's a number of reasons. Because they're self-conscious about how they look, because they don't want to be singled out, because maybe they don't have the answers, or their expectations that they perceive the teachers to have are above what they're able to give. So we're seeing some of that. Problematic behaviors, again, some of the outbursts, some of the anger, some of the irritability, somatic complaints, my stomach hurts, my head hurts, and then sleep and appetite problems. And again, it depends on, as a teacher, you may not see sleep or appetite problems, but you will certainly see the effects of a sleep problem if children are falling asleep on your Zoom session. So interventions, just, some quick interventions. So I find it very helpful to have children in that middle school age do comic strips about their life. First of all, it relieves a lot of tension. And second of all, it enables them to put into pictures a perspective of what's going on that sometimes they may not have the language to do. And sometimes I do directed art activities. And certainly teachers can do some of these activities as part of an assignment, so that we can gauge where children are. I have children develop first aid kits for me. And I had a school do this with their high school students. They had them do mental health first aid kits. And each child decided what mental health condition or issue that they needed a first aid kit for. So for instance, one of them created a first aid kit for anxiety that had a stress ball in it, and it had the packing for packages that the kids pop, and it had chewing gum, and it had a journal so that they could write down some things, and it had some fidget toys, and that was their first aid kit. So again, sometimes that's also very helpful, and what a great teachable moment to be able to teach those things. Body movement, and everybody thinks about yoga, and I've heard people say, I'm so tired of hearing about yoga, but body movement isn't just about yoga or exercise. It's just about getting our bodies up and going. And I recently sat in on a webinar with a very well-known pediatrician. And in the middle of the webinar, about 20 minutes in, he stood up in his little room and directed all of us to stand up and stretch and move our bodies so that we could keep paying attention, because the webinar was quite lengthy. And he acknowledged that getting into our body and moving was so important. So again, if an adult can do that on a webinar with a group of adults, we can certainly do that with our students and our children. Show and tell. We are basically in our students' homes. So while we don't see them in person anymore, which gives us a disadvantage, we are now in their homes. So on some level, we're learning some different things about our students. So I don't know about you, but when I have students or children in my therapy sessions on Zoom, sometimes I get a tour of their bedroom and I get to see everything that's hanging in their bedroom, and they'll take me all around the house. And that gives me some very good insight about what's happening there. The other thing is I really pay attention to what's interesting them. So I might give them some of these art activities to do, and then I might have them show me what they've done. And we can do that as part of teaching. Certainly SEL interventions, having morning meetings, having a check-in and a check-out. And I will have students do this sometimes on their own. Check in with yourself in the morning. So write down 3 things you're feeling when you get up in the morning. I'm feeling bored, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling sluggish. Okay, great. Check out in the afternoon. What am I feeling now? 1 word. What good thing happened today? 1 word. And then what am I looking forward to in the future? So again, simple check-in and check-outs, and we can do that as teachers all the time. So helping children from 10 to 13, which is our middle school age, very important for kids to have a schedule. Schoolwork, I've heard multiple things from children that sometimes the workload is exorbitant now that they're remote. I think we need to really watch that, because while teachers are feeling that they're teaching all day and then they're working all night answering emails and everything else, students are feeling like they're in school all day remotely and then they're doing all this volumes of homework. So I encourage teachers to really consider the work that you're giving and what goal you have for that work. Encouraging good sleep and hygiene. Again, my teenagers, I want to see them on Zoom, and we'll talk about how they're feeling and what they're looking like. a lot of times parents are not and teachers are not acknowledging the time that children are spending on schoolwork and finishing their assignments. And I think we just need to give them some kudos every now and then for how hard this is and how well they are doing. And again, that goes to my next point. It is very hard for that middle school age, validating that it's hard, acknowledging that they're trying. And if they're not trying, let's try to figure out what's going on so that we can help them to try. And it's also okay to share how we're doing. And that's not for teachers to share your personal life or, all your intimate details, but really acknowledging that you are struggling. So I did a response to a school of a child who killed themselves by suicide. And I was talking to a 7th grade class. And one of the things that the students shared was how hard it was to lose their friend, but also how hard it was at home because they felt like their parents were losing their patience and being very irritable with them. And one of the kids stood up and he said, I find it really hard. My dad's yelling at me all the time. And the children laughed, and I knew there was a joke that I missed. So I said, I hear you all laughing. What's the joke I'm missing? And they said, oh, he's the principal's son. And the principal happened to be in the back of the room. Actually, we were outside under a tent, and the principal, to his credit, stepped up and said, yep, I'm having a really hard time. And there are days when I go home and I'm really stressed out and I'm having a hard time just keeping myself in a calm place. And his son was just like, wow, like, I can't believe dad said that in front of everybody. And the other students were so appreciative that he acknowledged that he was struggling. So again, we have to acknowledge that we're having a hard time too. And then we have to suggest doing things together to manage that stress. And we're going to talk about some of those a little later. So I have some resources here, and you're going to get this PowerPoint. So these are some fun resources for this age group, and you can look at them. It'll give you some fun ideas to incorporate into your teaching that will allow you to have a little bit of a respite and also for them to have a little fun. So again, helping children ages 13 to 17. So this age group, it's really about connecting with peers. So some of the suggestions I have is when we're going on remote, giving them 10 minutes in the beginning of class to talk to peers, letting them do group work. I suggested a telephone tag check-in for this age group, because even though we might not hear from a student who might be missing in action, they know how to get a hold of them. So sometimes they can do the check-in and bring them into the group. Again, acknowledging their losses. We've talked about there's multiple levels of things that they're losing. A lot of times we tend to minimize children and teenagers' feelings. First of all, that makes them very angry and crazy. And second of all, it really tells them that we're not in touch with them and not listening. And we really need to not minimize how they're feeling. They're feeling very stressed out. They're feeling a lot of high emotions, and we need to acknowledge that. And so again, I suggest that adults and all adults who are working with children try to listen without reacting. If you're feeling like you want to react, I say the line that you need to say is tell me more. Instead of anything else that you can think of, just keep asking the child to tell you more, because they'll keep talking if you give them the platform to do so. Again, teenagers need some time to themselves, but I encourage everyone to have them get out of their rooms. And I've had teachers challenge children. Again, all teenagers are used to challenges. We've had some really negative ones in the past, the eraser challenge, the cinnamon challenge, those kinds of things. But these are new challenges that maybe we can do to get kids out of the house. So one of the challenges was to go around their neighborhood and pick up 10 leaves from different trees and bring them back to the class to show everybody. So again, here's a science class. We're having a lesson about biology and trees, and here it is, something that they can do that gets them out of the house. Again, you're going to see behavior and mood changes on remote. So, if you see those, reach out and ask them about them, or reach out to a parent. Again, providing things for them to connect. There's a lot of social video games, going for a walk, things like that. And again, if online therapy is needed, that's something you might want to suggest to the parent. Again, some resources for you to look at that will give you some help. I'm going to go past these. So stress in adolescent, and here's what it looks like so we can see it. Somatic complaints, lots of headaches, lots of I don't feel good without really any specific anything, withdrawal, shutting down, not wanting to be around people, being irritable and angry. We certainly see that. Sometimes their emotions are going from 0 to 180, and we need to acknowledge that they are going to have this increase in intense emotion. Academic performance, I'm not sure that we can expect the very best out of our students. That is not to say that we don't have expectations, but we also monitor that for what does the student need. Learning in this environment is really tough. I had a teenager say to me the other day, I feel like I start school 3 times since school started, because his school went remote, in person, and then hybrid. And so there was a different start every time. So understand that that throws them off as well. We are seeing some hopelessness in teenagers, and that's where the increase in depression, I believe, is coming from. And sometimes we need to be the beacon of hope. So we need to monitor where our level of hope is, because that's a really important factor. Again, we might not see appetite changes, but we're certainly going to see if kids are falling asleep in class. And I know last year when they went to remote, the teenagers were staying up till 3 and 4 in the morning, and then they could not stay awake at school. And we really had to reverse that and get them on a more routine schedule. And there might be some self-medicating. So understand that. The difficulty concentrating for teenagers is more that they're preoccupied with these other things that they're worried about. And so sitting in class is really hard for them to concentrate. So again, some interventions. We're aware of their feelings. Certainly if children are saying things to you that hint that they are thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves, we need to be able to have those conversations. If you are a person who cannot have that conversation, please get to somebody who can and let them have the conversation with the kid. We are seeing some increase in suicides during this pandemic, and I don't have numbers for that because the statistics are not out yet, but we are concerned about the rates. Using self-disclosure. Again, I'm having a hard time with this, but here's what I do. What could you do? And every child is not going to do what we do, but we can give them ideas, because part of the problem is a lot of kids in middle school and high school don't have coping strategies. And sometimes they can come up with some things, but oftentimes they may need help from us. Good discussion endings. Don't end a discussion on a bad note, because we don't know where that's going to go or where they're going to carry it to. So try to end on something that is, again, not happy, happy, joy, joy, but certainly something that is more positive than negative. Class specific activities. We need to really get teenagers and middle schoolers to have some investment about what are those things going to look like, and how can we do those differently so that we acknowledge that this is, your 8th grade year and you're going to go to high school, and what can we do to make that transition? We may not be able to have an 8th grade dance, but what can we have instead? Certainly monitored feelings of hate. There was a lot of that among teenagers when this first started, blaming certain races and cultures for the virus, and had to do a lot of correction around that. We answer questions. I never not answer a question that a teenager asks. If I don't know the answer, I tell them I don't know the answer. But in terms of questions about the virus, I always use the CDC guidelines. And if you go on the CDC website, they have ways to answer the questions for all age groups. Be honest. Teenagers and children know if you're lying. They also know if you're making it up. So don't just say, I don't know, and I'll find out. And staying calm. Like I said, they are vamping off of our emotions. So if we are rattled, if we are irritable, they will do the same. If we can stay calm, we can help them to be calm. We monitor extreme emotions. If there's huge mood swings, there may be need for some additional therapeutic intervention. Offering, comfort and support. That may not be you. It may be, okay, how can we get you the support that you need? Who is a support? What does that look like? And helping them to navigate that. Substance abuse, again, if we are resorting to that, we open the door for our teenagers to do that. So there was a case of a student whose mom went to happy hour all the time. And at one point the student said, Mom, you go to happy hour all the time, but it doesn't seem to make you happy. So again, we have to be very careful about what our reactions to stress are. Monitoring personal hygiene. I tell parents we need to get children out of bed and have them shower and change their clothes. If they want to sit in their sweatpants or their pajama pants through the day, that's okay, as long as they're clean and they've showered. So again, absence from school. I'm hearing this a lot from teachers, how to engage kids. And again, some of that is going to be incentive. We need to be very creative about the incentives we're doing. You know, if you show up 5 days a week, I give you 10 points towards your art grade or something, you know, and we have to be creative about that. And we need to make those incentives things that make the students engage, not what we think, you know, and sometimes we open that up for the students. Okay, how do we get you all to come to school? I know it's really hard, but what would be good incentives for you? And they might tell you some things, and some of their ideas are pretty good. Again, monitoring changes. If we know of kids who've already, or children who've already have a pre-existing condition, they suffer from anxiety or they suffer from depression, we need to watch them. Sometimes as teachers, we may not know that. And sometimes it may not have been diagnosed or treated yet. And so we need to watch for some of those signs and symptoms. And again, refer. There's plenty of mental health services. I was just notified today that DCPMP is offering free services for children who cannot afford services or do not have insurance. So please reach out to me. I will have Kadi put my email in the chat box. I can send you those resources. So I was very excited to hear that they were going to have that resource for children who did not have insurance. Here's some interventions I use with the older children. Journaling. I get them to keep a log. There's a lot of apps on their phones, since they love their phones, that do journaling. One that I like and I use in my practice all the time is My Diary. And that is because children are very leery about writing things down because they're afraid that siblings or parents are going to be reading and looking at what they're writing. And so My Diary has a nice little code that they can put in and it feels secure. And then sometimes, again, if they're in therapy or working with somebody, they will share that with them. You know, blogging. You know, I had one group of students create a blog. A COVID blog, that's what they call it. So again, let them create something that you're a part of. First aid kits, I already talked about them. The phone apps project, you know, that's something one of my schools did. They challenged the students to come up with apps that would help them deal with stress. And so students came back and said, I have the Calm app, or I have Headspace app, or one of those. And they found a whole lot more apps than I ever could. Certainly include music. Sometimes if you're letting them do free work or they're working on a paper, play some nice, you know, classical or melodical music in the background. And we need to laugh. That's a really important thing. So create some of those humorous moments. Maybe have the kids, you know, take turns every day, you know, bringing something funny to the classrooms, you know, incorporating relaxation techniques. Like I said, the gentleman whose webinar I attended, where he got up in the middle of the webinar, made all of us get up on camera. You know, sometimes if we incorporate those relaxation techniques into our classrooms, it helps us to relax as well as it helps children to relax. Again, I talked about creating a challenge. We can do that with our kids. They will come up with lots of challenges. And then challenge, you know, another challenge is having them get a new skill or a hobby. I had a teenager that I was really prompting to do that because she kept talking, only child. So she's very alone and spending a lot of time in her bedroom. And I said to her, just go on Pinterest, you know, look through that and see if anything interests you. And I had been telling her this for a couple weeks. It was in our sessions every time she said she was bored and we would talk about it. And then finally she went on and she came back and she said, I started a new hobby. And she was so excited. Her whole demeanor had changed. She was very excited. Her affect changed. And here she had found anime coloring books. And again, with anime, I always tell people there's some really dark stories, but some of it can be very funny and amusing. And she acknowledged that there were some dark stories. And she said, I'm not watching those because I don't like those. So again, here's what I call my stress kit. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but the first thing we need to do is we need to change children's mindset from a stress hurts mindset to a stress helps mindset. And we know that we have to understand the reason behind our child's stress, and it's very careful that we don't dismiss it. Oftentimes we think that what stresses a child out is so minimal and our stresses are much bigger, and we begin to compare, and then we really lose sight of the child. And it may seem trivial to us, but it's not trivial to them. And we need to educate them that stress is a natural part of life. It comes and goes. It can be beneficial. It can help you learn to take action. You can problem solve around it. And so we need to have them understand that, some stress is good, depending on how we handle it. The next thing we have to do is shift from a fixed to a growth mindset. And this is something a lot of times in a stressful situation, people feel that things cannot be fixed. It can't be improved, and they have no power to influence the situation. And this is where we really begin to go down that negative rabbit hole. And it's real easy to fall into that fixed mindset. So, if your student says, no matter how much I study, I'll never be able to pass these tests, it's hopeless. That's where I have to really help them to reframe the stress and really look at that different, that it's not about fixing this one test, and this one situation isn't going to be, all situations. And I really have to encourage them to find different solutions that will help them. So what I use is growth affirmations, and growth affirmations are really easy. I have a whole list of them. If you want them, I will certainly give them to you. But things like mistakes help me learn and grow. And where I go to when kids are all about like, I failed this test and I'm never going to go anywhere. And I here's my favorite example. I say to them, do you go to your doctor? And they say, yes. And I say, okay, do you know where your doctor graduated med school from? And they look at me. And they're like, no. I said, right, because we never ask doctors, where did you graduate medical school? We just want to know if they're good doctors. Even as parents, we don't look up where they went to medical school. We look up how many lawsuits they have against them. So again, it's, learning that sometimes these mistakes help us to grow and we learn from them. Sticking with things and not giving up. That's another growth affirmation. Becoming a problem solver versus being a problem producer, going after new things. The next thing is, stopping catastrophic thinking, that all or nothing, that the worst thing is going to happen. And so sometimes with children, I say, what is the worst thing that can happen in this case? So, if I fail this test, my whole life is ruined. Okay, so what's the worst thing that can happen if you fail this test? Well, my grade will go down to a C. Okay, and if your grade goes down to a C, what happens? Well, I have to list the marking period to bring it up. Okay, so how can you do that? So do you see how I problem solve through the steps with them and I get them out of that catastrophic thinking? Because sometimes when we get in that catastrophic thinking, it's really hard for us to come out of it. I might do what would happen next? So if you failed this test, then what would happen? And they can go through the steps. And then what I get to is the next place of the stress toolkit, which is problem solving. Okay, let's brainstorm some solutions, and again, I listen more than I talk. And I help them to think about each solution that they come up with and what are the pros and cons of that solution. So if they come up with, okay, I failed the test, so I can talk to the teacher about extra credit, or I can talk to the teacher about tutoring, or I can talk to the teacher about getting a buddy. Okay, so let's take each of those solutions, those problem solving solutions, and let's do a pro and con list around them. And then I let the child decide which solution they're going to pick. And it's really important to allow them to have that control to pick the solution instead of us always telling children what to do. Because a lot of times when we begin telling children what to do, they stop listening to us anyway. So it's important if we can get them to think about a solution without us giving it to them. And then I try stress management techniques, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. If you don't know what any of these are, just email me. I'll certainly spend some time with you either on the phone or another Zoom to help you with some of these. Listening to music, taking brain breaks. It's one of the things I tell teachers all the time. Give everybody a brain break and give it to them from this premise. I need a brain break, so I'm guessing you all must too. So let's take a brain break and maybe everybody tell me their favorite color, or everybody think of their favorite cartoon character and tell me why. A brain break, it gets us out of the stress of the school and into something that might be fun. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, which is, the 5 senses. Name 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 that you can feel, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste, and tell me what they are. And that really just settles us back into our body. So this is my stress toolkit for students. And then very, very important is we have to monitor our own stress. Are we stressed? How are we dealing with stress? What does stress look like? A lot of times people don't know that they're being stressed out. And I tell them, pay attention to what children say around you or what your coworkers are saying. So if people are asking you over and over, are you okay? They're telling you that there's something that's not quite right. So again, listen to those people. We have to monitor our stress. Again, they will vamp off of us. So if we're very stressed out and we're coming to class and we're harried and we're irritable and we're all of that, our students are going to give us that response back. They're the mirror. So sometimes if we're getting a lot of that from the people around us, we need to look in the mirror at ourselves, because that might be us and we might not be handling our stress as well. And that's something for us to really look at and do some stress management techniques. So that is my, and here, so I'm sorry. So helping with mental health, here's just some things. Again, we've talked about a lot of these, but, limit the exposure to social media. I find this is not helpful for anybody. We've talked about some of the other things, but aromatherapy, really helpful. My teenagers are really getting into candles and aromatherapy. I'm encouraging them to reduce caffeine. That doesn't help anything. A gratitude practice, something I know a lot of people do, but when I talk to teenagers about gratitude, I talk to them about very simple gratitude practices. So when I wake up in the morning, I'm grateful I can walk, I can talk, I can see. When I go to bed at night, I'm grateful that everybody I know is healthy, and I think of one good thing that happened during the day. Developing some meditative schools and the toolbox, the toolbox we already really talked about. And then here's just some COVID care. A lot of the same things that I've been saying, except for letting the light in, which is actually the sunshine, and getting out sometimes, even when it's cold, into the sunshine, creating a vision. So what does it look like? What am I looking forward to when all of this is over? Children are great at this. Teenagers are great at this. They have a whole list. So sometimes I have them make a collage around it or draw a picture around it, trying something new. These are all things that can help students. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A now. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to put our evaluation code up there. If any of you are planning to jump off right away, please fill out the evaluation. Like Kadi said, it is how we get our funding. And we are certainly really want to hear from you and your response to our webinars that we do. So Kadi, I'm going to turn it back to you to see what kind of questions we have.
Thank you, PJ, and thank you for providing us with such a wealth of information, especially in these very challenging and stressful times, as you mentioned. So as PJ mentioned, we, our activities, our training activities are funded through SAMHSA, and as part of receiving this funding, we're required to submit data related to the quality of this event. So if you have a smartphone available, if you could please scan the QR code on the screen and complete our very short evaluation survey. So that way, we get credit for your participation. And as I mentioned in the chat room, in the chat box, if you have any questions that you'd like to have, any specific questions that you'd like to ask PJ, you can either enter them in the chat or in the Q&A pod and the bottom Zoom menu bar. If you have any specific questions related to stress management during COVID, or seeing stress in the students during COVID, or if there was something that you'd like further elaboration or clarification on, please feel free to also enter that information in the Q&A pod or in the chat.
And if you're not comfortable and you have a question that you'd like to ask me, on the side, feel free to email me, and I will certainly answer that question. I know that in the past, when I presented to your community, I had some questions that people emailed me afterwards, and I tried to help as best I could. So please feel free to do that as well.
So PJ, I had a question regarding the students, especially at the adolescent level. You mentioned that sometimes their school participation and attendance can be very much affected by the current pandemic. and other stressors, just being a teenager in itself, and everything they face, it could be a very interesting time. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the flexibility aspect, so that way, you know, um, they feel like they have more options and it's not something that they have to challenge?
So I'm going to answer your question. You're just going to have to tell me if I'm answering the right question. So a lot of times teenagers and children feel like they have no control over situations, and oftentimes they are correct, because as adults, we are always trying to steer them to a direction that we think is helpful for them. And sometimes we miss that they need that piece. So that whole idea of the stress toolkit, where we generate solutions and we really have them generate solutions, and then we have them choose what choice they're going to make. And again, even when I'm working with teenagers, I try to give them choices so that, certainly choices I can live with, that are healthy and appropriate for them, but giving them the ultimate final say is really important because they feel like they have no control. So we need to be flexible, and sometimes, and the other piece is, and I talk about this in my parenting webinars, is that sometimes if we know a child's choice is not the best, there is an important learning in allowing them to select that choice and have it not come out well, so that we can then help them problem solve through what did happen and why did it not go well, and what could I have done differently, and maybe I will try another solution. So as long as it's not going to be anything that hurts them, sometimes it's okay to let teenagers make a decision that I know is not so great, so that they can learn from that, because that is learning for them. And that's a teachable moment. So
Yes. So basically, there are certain lessons that are taught, in making quote unquote a mistake, that doing the right thing will not teach, but learning a lesson from a mistake is definitely has other lessons that can be learned from, if we're always avoiding it, right? So I do see one question. A few actually came up, and I just wanted to get it in. What to do when students won't participate or talk, or someone else said an 11th graders refuse to talk at all, and I'm assuming participating in Zoom discussions or Zoom classes or online or in-person classes. So to encourage participation, any tips there?
So Zoom is very much like the classroom. We have students who sit in classes and don't participate because they're nervous, because they're self-conscious, because they have self-image problems or self-esteem problems, and we need to be in tune to that, and we need to be empathetic to that. But there's some other ways. So like in the classroom, I say, we can use Post-its. And I have a Post-it board. On Zoom, the chat room is a great thing for people to be able to offer suggestions. Sometimes, if there's a Q&A, they can put a question in there and it can be anonymous. And those are very important features for teachers to be able to use. Sometimes I tell them, have the teachers let the students email them questions. Not that you're going to answer all those questions all night long, but make a list of those questions. And then the next day when you start the class, address those questions so that you're hitting those questions that maybe that child is embarrassed to ask, or doesn't want to ask, or doesn't want everybody looking at them. And so that's a very important thing. The other thing is to offer incentives. What kind of incentives? And talk to the students about that. And I tell people sometimes when I'm on a webinar, sometimes it's very hard when I can't see anybody and I feel like I'm talking to a screen. And then sometimes people will come on and they'll be like, oh, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. And I'm like, it's okay. If you're on and I can see you and you're eating, I don't care, but it's better to see somebody. And sometimes we need to let the students know that might be our need. And sometimes they'll be more willing to work with us.
Sure. Well, thank you. And then it's the top of the hour, but I just want to get this one question in, because it's had a sense of urgency. Are there any practical steps we can take right now to reduce stress for students in higher level subjects, such as AP classes, where the coursework is already rigorous and the expectations are higher, already there during this challenging time?
So with the AP courses, what I've recommended to teachers is, yes, I understand the rigor of AP. I understand the level And I understand the amount of workload, but there needs to be some flexibility. So maybe an answer is, I have 2 nights of homework, and then I have 2 nights, Monday and Tuesday I have homework, Wednesday I give them off. Thursday and Friday I have homework, Saturday and Sunday I give them off. And the other thing is also talk to the students about what is stressing them out about the AP course and see how we can work with them on it. Sometimes it's as simple as they have a big project and they're overwhelmed by it because they're looking at the big project as a big thing. And if we can break it down into little steps for them, it is more manageable, but they may not know how to do that. And so we may have to help them. So that's a very immediate strategy as well. So those are 2 ones that I can think of off the top of my head that I have used in the past. Breaking down those big assignments is huge because sometimes they don't know how to do that and they look at it all as one big task. The other thing is eliminating the stuff that doesn't really make any difference. Maybe I do a 12-page paper and I decrease it to 8, or maybe I do, read 4 chapters to read 2. But we need to have some flexibility. That's so important. And again, I'm not about decreasing necessarily the rigor, but I am about being flexible about how we disperse that rigor over the amount of days and the times that students have.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, we've reached the top of the hour, and I just want to respect everyone's time. And thank you, PJ, for providing this webinar. And I had posted your email in the chat box if you have any questions, and I will also share my email in case you'd like to reach me. We thank you so much for participating, and I know that maybe you don't have a question right now, but maybe it'll come later, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or ideas for us. Our center is very happy to hear from you. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and time off. I don't know if your school is providing time off for students, but if they are, wonderful. If they're not, of course, continue to reach out to us. Our contact information is in the chat. PJ, any last comments?
No, please reach out to me if there's any questions that you didn't ask or didn't get answered, and I'll be happy to give you some feedback, either again via phone or email. And everyone, be safe and healthy, and hope that the new year is wonderful for all of you.
Absolutely. We also hope, I also wish that you all have a healthy and happy new year. Thank you, Neda, for your comments. And that's all for today. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.